here. Thank you everybody for attending today's discussion, push button compliance for PCI DSS eSkimming controls. My name is Matt McGurk. I'm our head of field engineering here at Source Defense. Let me give you just a word or two about Source Defense and what we do. We work in a part of cybersecurity called web application client-side security. Is what our company was founded to do. We're exclusively dedicated to providing security solutions that work with and secure the code inside of web pages. So JavaScript is what that's typically called. We've been around for about 10 years now, all in told. We're very lucky to have some great partnerships across the industry and have been recognized in a bunch of different categories and different awards. And so we know what we're doing, I guess is to sum that up. As was mentioned, my name is Matt. I'm our head of field engineering. So all of our public facing technology stuff, demonstrations, webinars, proofs of concept, and et cetera, run through my office. I've been here for, in fact, 7 years. I have to update this slide, but I've been here for a very long time. Basically worked with all of our customers along the way. I see some of you on the call right now. It's good to see you again. And I've been talking about the DSS stuff very exclusively. Well, not exclusively, but almost exclusively for the past couple of years, ever since the first version of 4.0 came out. And this was on everybody's mind. So in terms of format and agenda, what we're going to do today is do a brief recap of the problem statement, like what is eSkimming and why is it interesting to us, the DSS requirements, and then most importantly, we're going to talk about what Source Defense does and how we can help with that and make it as easy as possible, in particular for folks who have a complex use case, meaning you've got a website or a web application with lots and lots of domains, or you've got lots of web applications and websites in your organization that you need to manage. Just basically, how do you do cool stuff as easily as possible and make sure your sites are compliant? So real quickly, eSkimming and MageCart and form jacking attacks, where did this all come from? If you look over the recent-ish, it's past 20 years now, so not that recent, but you see MageCart, which was the original, kind of inside baseball cybersecurity term for an eSkimming attack around 2016. You see a few kind of very large, high-profile incidents related to security stuff inside of web pages. British Airways had a breach. Some other high-profile ones that come to mind are things like Equifax actually had one of these just like a couple months after the big Equifax breach that everybody knows about, and a number of others along the way. And then you see kind of tick up into a general drumbeat of thousands or tens of thousands of these incidents every month, particularly as widespread platform-based attacks occurred. So somebody finds a vulnerability in a very common e-commerce platform, exploits that, and then you end up with a front end, a client-side attack as kind of the follow-up, as the kicker to it, to get the data out of the website. Most recently, and probably importantly to this audience, is that the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard and the Payment Card Industry Security Council became interested and focused on solving eSkimming attacks because they had become so dangerous to the online payment ecosystem. The first version of the data security standard, version 4.0, was introduced in draft in 2022. You saw a lot of other growth and adoption, particularly on the heels of COVID and et cetera, in online payments and so on and so forth. And then finally in 2025, that PCI DSS document went from draft to entirely the live version, as well as a handful of requirements specifically related to eSkimming that went from best practice to required just this past year, just this past April. The 2 requirements related to eSkimming are now required of everybody who has credit card information on their website. And we'll talk about that a little bit more detail in a moment, because there were some changes, not really changes, but some clarifications which provided very little clarity back in March. So I'll dig into that in a second, the SAQA stuff, if anyone knows where I'm going with that. And if not, I'll describe it more in a second. Real briefly, and again, the problem statement, JavaScript is at fault here. JavaScript is the language that makes everything inside of a web page interactive. So without JavaScript, you've got text and images, really. With JavaScript, you've got a full-blown normal 2025 modern web application. The issue with this stuff is that browsers by default have no security model for JavaScript. If it's code in the browser, it can do whatever it wants. It can access whatever visitor data it wants, and it can change the web page however it wants. Sometimes this is a benefit. So if you think about things like dynamic advertising or real user monitoring tools or analytics tools, that level of access to the visitor and the web page serves a business purpose. Sometimes different regulations have an issue with that business purpose. So, I mean, that's a little bit different than DSS, but things like HIPAA and FERPA and GDPR, if you have that in your compliance regime for your org, you should think about the data privacy implications of that. But nonetheless, the real dangerous part of this is that attackers can use that fact that the web browser has no native security controls to get to steal information, basically. So when a visitor goes to your website, that visitor's web browser here will load a bunch of different JavaScript from across the internet in addition to your own JavaScript. So there's kind of two flavors. You've got third-party JavaScript, meaning integrations from outside of your web application itself. And then, of course, the first-party JavaScript, which is coming from your own applications and servers. So if an attacker gets into either of those places, either your own server or one of these other servers out here on the internet, they can then place code in that location, and then end up in the visitor's web browser, and then they can exploit, or more so take advantage of all those capabilities that I've been talking about along the way. More often than not, it's used for the purposes of what we're calling here data exfiltration, but put more simply, stealing stuff, stealing visitor information from the web page. eSkimming is the term that DSS uses. So, that's the problem statement, and that's why the Security Council has mandated that we all do something about that. A couple more, nitty-gritty things in the recent past. We have seen an uptick in large language model usage in these kind of attacks. What I mean by that is that part of this, and I'll illustrate this in a second, but part of this attack often relies on looking like the web page in question, like imitating the look and feel of the legitimately acting web application. And so that can be really useful in cases like generating attack kits, or otherwise generating, just like any other large language model stuff, generating content. So if your goal as an attacker is to convince a visitor to a website that your content, your malicious content, is legitimate, it can be really useful to have ChatGPT generate a fake web form that you can inject rather than you having to write it by hand. So just like anything else in the world, attackers are taking advantage of that efficiency provided by those new tools. The other thing that's important about to understand about eSkimming at this point is the not quite rise, but we've gotten a lot better at describing this specific kind of attack, a double entry attack, to help illustrate the problem with relying entirely on something called an iframe, an inline frame, as the way to solve for this. So in the past, a very good way to, well, it wasn't ever a good way, but how most people did this was to use, and still do, was to use a payment service provider to embed a payment form, to provide a payment form that was embedded into a web page that an organization owned, and then handle the credit card transactions that way. So an iframe, for anyone who's not familiar with web dev, is a way of embedding one web page into another web page. And those two web pages, although they look like they're the same entity, are distinct. They're completely separate. They're the equivalent of having two different browser tabs open. And so as a result, you get a pretty clean separation of concerns, and you have a very clean way of de-scoping, or you did, in DSS 3.2. This would have put you in a lot stronger place in 3.2 to say, my PSP, my payment service provider, is handling all of this for me. Nobody can break into this iframe because of technical reasons with how browsers work, so no big deal. Under 4.0, that has changed, where you now have to care about this, even if you're using that iframe approach. And the reason you have to care about it, at least in part, is because of this double entry attack. So a double entry attack really relies on these two things, where the attack is going to overlay or remove or kind of shuffle out of place the legitimate payment form, the legitimate iframe, and then it will replace that iframe with its own form. And so what the visitor will do is put their information into the fake form, right? They're going to type in their credit card number. That transaction will then fail because, of course, it's a fake form. It can't do any actual payment stuff. And then once the attacker has that card number, the attacker will then replace their form. They'll remove it. And then they will let the normal, legitimate payment form load. So as a result, the visitor will enter their card number twice, hence the double entry part of the equation. And the attacker will get the card number, and the visitor, the consumer, will be able to complete their transaction. That's why you call it a double entry attack. So what I like or appreciate about this form of attack is it gets to the heart of what the attacker is trying to do, which is steal card numbers. They don't really care about the ability for them. They don't, it's not like a mission impossible thing for them. How can I be as slick as possible and break into the iframe and yada, yada. All they want to do is siphon off card numbers, and this lets them do it very cleanly. And also, as I mentioned before, now you can just have AI generate the fake form for you. You can use an off-the-shelf kit to take care of it in terms of getting the code into place, and it's a very clean and easy to use if you're on the wrong side of the fence solution. Security Metrics had this interesting blurb about this, where they said in their analysis and their exposure to these attacks, none of them were a result of the payment iframe, the contents of that iframe being compromised. Every single attack that they saw and that they worked with were caused by breaches on the page into which the iframe was loaded, which makes sense, in my opinion, because the two things were just different levels of security concern until recently. And so the payment service providers had their stuff hardened, and everybody else had a little bit more lax. I mean, appropriately so. I'm not saying anybody did anything really wrong. I'm just saying, like, we all used to separate our concerns and say the payment service provider was handling it, and now we can't do that anymore because of Mageford. One other note here, as I mentioned, the SAQA was amended. The self-attestation questionnaire version A was amended in February of this past year, which frankly caused a fair amount of confusion in the space because people said, oh, well, these two requirements about eSkimming have been removed from the standard. And that's not accurate. What the council did was to change the eligibility criteria for this particular SAQ. So if you were an org and you fill out the SAQA, you now have to meet these there's two new things, at least two new things, you have to do to be eligible to use this form. If you don't do these things, you may not use this form. And you can see down here, basically you have to say that the payment page or forms are delivered entirely from the PSP or the payment service provider or like platform provider. And that your website is not susceptible to attacks from scripts that could affect your e-commerce systems. So you have to make sure that really the root of this, or the heart of this for me, in my opinion, is that the merchant must understand that, or must prove that their site is not susceptible to script-based attacks. If you cannot answer this challenge if you can't say that you do this, then you have to do you have to go to a different SAQ. You have to use an AEP or a D or other stuff. And because if you're using one of those other ones, you have to do 643 and 1161. So really the break point here for anybody is, can you say that your site is not susceptible? Okay, then you can complete the SAQA. Can you not say that your site is not susceptible? Okay, well then you have to use another SAQ or another attestation method, and then you have to do 643 and 1161. So really it's just confusing, and at the end of the day, it kind of nets out that everybody still has to solve this problem. But they just have to kind of do a little dance if you're trying to maintain SAQA eligibility. And as with all these things, I would recommend that you defer to your QSA or your ISA or et cetera, because I can offer you my interpretation, but ultimately those guys and gals are going to be the ones responsible for, saying whether you're cool or not with those requirements. DSS, like I said, the two requirements themselves are 643 and 1161. So those are pretty straightforward when you boil them down. You have to make sure that any JavaScript on your payment pages is inventoried. You have to make sure it's authorized to be there and you've got a written justification for it. You have to implement a method to assure the integrity of each payments page script. And then in the cousin requirement in 11.6.1, you have to monitor the payment page script contents and also monitor HTTP response headers. So basically tamper proof. I mean, you can see it if you're squinting in that document there in 11.6.1 in the first paragraph, basically. That there's a tamper detection mechanism. So the two things put into concert is you need to make sure that you're not, the scripts aren't doing stuff you don't want them to do, and that they don't change in a meaningful way without you knowing about it. In DSS, just as a note, the only frequency put in here anywhere is literally this word at least weekly or periodically. Otherwise, it's going to depend on your own targeted risk assessment and your own goals as an organization. It is way better, in my opinion, to use a technique which is real time and reports frequently rather than, I don't know, if I was practically trying to solve this problem, I wouldn't rely on any of it to happen at least once a week to be a sufficient approach to make sure my site is secure. But I just thought I'd point that out because everything else in here is like promptly or as soon as possible or et cetera. Those are the actual words that define any kind of period in here. So to sum it up, you got to do these four things. And that's the challenge for anybody who's faced with a web application that has card information in it. I want to show you, I'm going to start here. I'm going to pull up a browser and talk about what source defense does. I also want to talk about some other approaches that are mentioned in DSS, just so we can see that. Let me blank this out. So I just want to show you kind of a practical thing. If we go to, I don't know, any given, I'll use one of my demo sites here. So here's a example e-commerce site. It's got some, shop pages. It's got some checkout process in it. The challenge for someone, if they were trying to make sure this site was compliant, is that they would need to make sure that all of the JavaScript that loads into this web page, what I just did here was open up Chrome DevTools and tell my browser, hey, show me all of the files, all of the code that loads into my browser as I visit this website. And as you can see here, there are 53 different pieces of JavaScript that are loaded into my browser on the request of this website. We see things in here that are served from the website itself, so headphonescity.com. So that means that these files came from this website directly, and that they're most likely authored. I, the merchant, own this stuff. This is my code. I can talk to my devs and figure out where it came from. The rest of this stuff, I'd say the other 70% of this, is from third-party sources. It came from other parts of the internet. It's a marketing integration. It's a customer support integration. Maybe it's an app dev kind of thing where we're getting reports about how the web page is acting back to the developers. But the point is that all this code is coming from somewhere else. And I need to manage it if this is a payment page where this code is loading. So the challenge here for anybody who's like doing this by hand, so to speak, or using a technique like content security policy or sub-resource integrity would be to literally go through all this, figure out where it came from, both in terms of from the internet, but also organizationally, like who in my org decided this should be here. I have to figure out what it does. I have to figure out a mechanism to assure the integrity of it. And I have to do things like have a mechanism to block it, and et cetera. But basically, this is the beginning of the work for me. What we would recommend here at Source Defense is using a tool to do this for you. We have our own tools to do just that. And what I wanted to talk about, as I mentioned, would be what we would do in the case of having an e-commerce site or any other kind of website that has lots of different domains or lots of different websites in my portfolio. So maybe my company has, 24 different brands and we need to manage all of them and make sure they're compliant. Maybe we have presence in 45 countries, so we have a bunch of different top-level domains for the same application. But basically, like, how can I solve for that with a tool and make it as easy as possible? So what you're seeing on the screen here is Source Defense. This is this is our PCI DSS dashboard. So like I said at the top, we're a company that only does security in this space. One way to think about us is that our customers who were on board, say 5 years ago, before the requirements were written, would have been compliant before they were written, if that makes sense. So we've always been solving this problem. This dashboard in our interface is specific to DSS and explaining both to a user as well as maybe to their QSA what source defense is doing to make that website where we're installed compliant. And by the way, I'm not going to go into too much deployment here, but we are added to the web pages in question. It's copy and paste deployment. We run inside the web page, and then we do everything you're seeing on the screen here in terms of reporting and security functionality. But the idea here is this dashboard is going to walk me through the tasks I need to complete in order to make sure the site is compliant and do those things like verifying authorization and justifying scripts and monitoring headers and so on and so forth. So I think you can see at least the beginning of how this would work for a single site. What I want to do here is pop this out to a multi-site kind of model. So what I did here was just click on this upper left. You can see my company, Headphone City, has a number of different international sites across the globe. And so source defense is letting me manage all of that in one single place. And I can see down here in this table, the individual rates of completion for the compliance tasks, compliance items in each of those sites. I can see all that in one complete view. So if my Asian Pacific teams have a different compliance mandate, and that team is managing those sites, I can see how good Singapore and Japan are doing with that, as opposed to the rest of the org, and so on and so forth. We do, like I said, consolidate those tasks into a couple handy workflows. So the two main things here in terms of like day-to-day tasks that somebody needs to do to be compliant are to inventory the JavaScript and justify it. That's really like one of the most, as I've seen people wrestle with this out in the world. Doing that takes time. And the other thing is on an ongoing basis, monitoring the integrity of their payment page scripts and that tamper proofing. Those two tasks, those two parts of the standard are the most ongoing care and feeding operations of solving for these compliance requirements. So we make that really easy. So if I need to justify the scripts on my pages, I just click this button here, and this will bring me to a list of all of the scripts that still lack a justification across my sites. I can narrow this down to one individual site, or I can see everything in aggregate across the entire estate. The other thing I can do in here that's really cool and makes this very easy to do is it's real common to see the same JavaScript tools deployed across multiple instances, multiple countries in this case, of the same website. So for instance, maybe we're using the tool LivePerson here in all of our different territories. So what I did was just click on that LivePerson entry over in the list, and now I'm looking at all of the sites across my estate where LivePerson is in use, as well as a bunch of other critical information about it. When did we last see it? It looks like it was first deployed on our main site 3 years ago, and the rest of our sites picked it up recently. So that kind of high-level stuff. And then from a compliance standpoint, what I can do here is just tick this box and say, let me work on all these at once. And so I've got my two different tasks here. One is to review the behaviors and assure the integrity of those scripts. The second thing is to justify. So in the case of justification, I just edit my justification. I can automatically generate those. Source Defense will create them for me. And then I can click authorize and justify here. And now all of those sites have been authorized and justified. And when I go back to my dashboard here, all of these numbers have gone up appropriately. So I just took care of authorizing and justifying LivePerson across 6 different web applications in basically one click. And so that kind of work, rather than asking you to go find on each of those different domains, each of the files that makes up each of these things, saves an immense amount of effort, in my opinion. The same thing holds for behavioral, for integrity assurance. So what Source Defense does, we don't rely on file hashes. There's some file hashing in there under the hood. I'll just kind of leave it there. But really what we rely on to assure the integrity of payment page scripts is to look at their behavior. And so here you can see in these little tooltips and flyouts, the different behavior that each of these scripts is performing inside of the web pages. So for instance, LivePerson is transferring data to other parts of the internet. It's using first-party cookies, and it's using browser storage. So what I can do is acknowledge these behaviors. That's saying that, yep, I understand what it's doing, and also that that is the normal operations of the script. And now what Source Defense is going to do in the future is only notify me if those change. So if those behaviors deviate from what I expect, you'll receive an alert, and that'll get taken care of. But the idea is that with that one click, I was able to reassure, in that case, the integrity of those scripts. Say, yes, these are new behaviors, and I understand that they're happening, but they're cool and they're the normal operations, and that will let me move on with my compliance tasks. So all that put together means that I could zip through the compliance work for all 6 of these sites. I would say in realistically under an hour, if I've got the right subject matter. Like if I know if I know anything about our websites and I know why those tools are installed there, then I've got the task pretty cleanly in front of me. Last but not least, and probably maybe most importantly, depending on what your goals are, I can export reporting on all of this from here as well. So this button that I just clicked will export an archive of everything that a QSA would want to know about this tool and how well it's satisfying for that or it's meeting that requirement, and the work that I've done, writing all those justifications and et cetera. This will be one-stop shopping for proof that we've been doing that compliance work. So you're not like hopping through here and taking screenshots and grabbing stuff manually. It's just it's there with a bow on it, so to speak, as well as some glossy. We also have executive style reports that will let you provide something a little more visual if you've got a CFO or someone else who just wants a report on their desk to explain not to sound too cynical about it, but to explain the budget line item. This can help a lot with that as well. So in either case, if it's more descriptive or it's more nitty gritty evidence for an attestation, we can do both of those. That's in addition to the other, like there's a lot of other functionality in our platform. Of course, I'm seeing about 50-50 new faces, so to speak, on the phone, as well as 50% folks who've seen this before. So I'm kind of like walking the line. I don't want to bore anyone too much, but Source Events overall has a lot of different tools and technology to help you make this task easier. So things like automatically finding and inventorying all of the scripts on your payment pages, classifying them into services. What I mean by that is you don't have to care about what individual files make up Hotjar. We're just going to tell you Hotjar, that service, is running on your pages, as well as in this case, visualizing the relationship between these different scripts, which particularly can make that justification work very easy. So you can see here that the Google Global Site Tag, which is very hard to say, by the way, the Google Global Site Tag is running on this web page, and it's running on it because it was loaded by Google Analytics, which in turn was loaded by Google Tag Manager. So if I have to write a justification for the Google Global Site Tag, that becomes a lot easier to do with this kind of visualization rather than doing it by hand. Secondly, you can see all the behaviors in aggregate for the different scripts. So if I want to know what's setting cookies or what's transferring data out of the browser, and then importantly as well is the event model. So like I mentioned, part of the solution is about determining, like you can say, here's the normal operations of the script, here's a baseline of the good behaviors of the script, and then we'll alert you to those changes. Basically, different behaviors will combine into events, and then we can send them out of our system in a number of different ways, via email alert, via webhook. There's an API if you want to do a different kind of integration, but suffice it to say, this is how we can transmit the information about the health and the compliance of your web application out of Source Events and into the system of preference for your organization. Alerting, of course, also lives in the platform. So if you want to see the new behaviors here, you can do that. Last but not least, and maybe like most importantly, in fact, is our technology that we call Source Events Protect. That's our replacement for or alternative to something like content security policy. So what Source Events Protect will do is basically let you control what these scripts are and are not allowed to do as they're running inside your visitor's web browser. So for instance, here you can see for Google Analytics, on my demonstration site, we are redacting sensitive information if Google Analytics tries to access it. So for instance, if Google Analytics is maybe misconfigured, so like a marketing team sets it up and has a very broad, it says, hey, grab whatever you can off the website so we can use it for marketing stuff, or Google Analytics is used in part of an attack. In either case, Source Defense is going to step in and prevent that script from taking sensitive information, card data, for instance. It'll defeat an eSkimming attack before that's a problem. And these rules are provided by Source Defense. We call these policies, and we provide them to our customers, meaning that you're not, unlike CSP, you're not having to write these and verify them and maintain them. It's just something Source Defense does for you. And these can actually be applied automatically. So there's actually 0 clicks involved in this one if you want to set it up and just run it in autopilot, which most of our customers do. They just set up Source Defense Protect, it runs, we keep the policies up to date for them, and then they don't have to sweat it, either from a compliance or from a practical security standpoint. So I'm going to bring it back here and just kind of sum it up on the PCI dashboard, which is to say that this can be and is one-stop shopping for all of your different compliance tasks across all the different parts of your organization. And one more note, I am weirdly proud of our in-product tutorials, which I know is like the world has had in-product tutorials for a long time. But I think it's particularly useful in this case because it will walk someone through. Let's say that the people on the phone right now are not going to be doing the day-to-day compliance work. It's going to be somebody else in the organization. The platform will walk another person through what they need to do in your own data, without you having to do it. So I mean, it's kind of a weird thing to talk about, but this will let you pass the work. You don't have to become a trainer in source defense. We'll be there support-wise for you the whole way. Our professional services and support teams, don't get me wrong, are very responsive and are often one of the things that people fortunately compliment us on. We're grateful for that. But nonetheless, if you don't want to talk to support, if you don't want to train somebody else in it, the product will do that for you, which I think is a big thing in my opinion. So to sum up, I think the two things I kind of wanted to land on, although there's a little more detail here, is the idea that we're doing a lot of behind the scenes signal processing for you. So when we're talking about, there's one click to be compliant, this is as easy to use as possible. What I'm trying to tell you here is why is it so easy to do? Because we're doing so much in the background for you. We're collecting that data from the site. We're looking at the signals that it generates. We're automatically creating events out of those signals, and then we'll alert you as necessary to the severity and the content of the event. Or in the case of Source Defense Protect, we'll literally just stop those kind of attacks before they can do damage. The second part, like I mentioned, so signal processing is the first part, and all that intelligence and automated classification. That's the first part. Second part is Source Defense Protect, which is going to actually block the kind of behavior and the kind of activity that is essential to a Mage card attack being perpetrated. And it does it without you needing to intervene. So one way to think about Source Defense Protect is it's like automatically remediating this problem, and also just really dramatically improving your overall data hygiene. What I mean by that is you can ensure that under different compliant, so DSS says don't let them steal card numbers. Source Defense Protect lets you say none of the visitors' data is leaving the site. So if you've got California business, if you've got Europe business, if you've got healthcare stuff, if you've got higher ed stuff, Source Defense Protect can help sanitize the data in all those cases and make sure your tools aren't just overreaching. If anybody just follows the news on this stuff, Meta, Facebook's parent company, is getting sued all the time for different instances of their marketing tools being installed in different places. It's important beyond just the DSS implications. So that's what brings us to the end of my spiel for today. I'm happy to answer questions. If anyone wants to throw them into the chat, the Q&A function, I'm happy to take those. If you want to see what we can do for you in specific, you can hit up sourcedefense.com/freepci or scan that QR code. We can set up a dashboard for you without you deploying any code. You can see what this would look like for your site, and you can play around with it. Also, if you do want to test it in a more kind of like in-depth sense, me and my team would be happy to help you evaluate, deploy the code in a testing environment, see how it could work. Usually that takes about an hour and a half of meetings. We can get it done in about 1 week. So if you're trying to get compliant, we're already past the deadline. If you're trying to backfill your compliance requirements, we should be able to get you up and running very, very, very quickly. So I'll hang out here for a second, see if there's questions, and see where we go from there. All right, so I'm seeing a question here, which is that I'm an SAQA eligible merchant. It seems that if my payment service provider, so the language, I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing here. So the SAQA says that if your PSP can prove that the way you're implementing their iframe makes your website not susceptible to script-based attacks, then that's one way to satisfy the SAQA eligibility. So basically what you can say is you can go to your PSP and say, hey, in your responsibility matrix for your offering, do you have some way to harden the web page into which your iframe is embedded to make sure that web page isn't susceptible to script-based attacks. I'm not up to speed with every single payment processor's latest or payment service provider's latest product offerings, but I'm not sure anybody does that right now. And I would, I just check to see what you're doing and that the responsibility matrix is what it's supposed to be. But yeah, there's two ways to do that in in the SAQA eligibility, either to say yourself, vouch for yourself and say we've made sure our site is not susceptible to script-based attacks, or to say, yeah, the PSP somehow is making my web page secure and not susceptible to script-based attacks. So those are the two avenues you can pursue to maintain SAQA eligibility. Second question about redirects, popular topic. So in the e-commerce guidance document that came out a little while ago, which is a good document, by the way, for anyone who hasn't read it and is looking for some light compliance reading, they council put out a e-commerce eSkimming guidance. I'm going to actually pull it up on the screen here. Guidance document that goes into way more detail. It's kind of like color to put around the requirements. It's nothing new. There are no new rules in here exactly, but it provides a lot more explanation and context for all this stuff. So if you're curious, this is a good read, in my opinion. They have some language about redirects in here. The basic idea is if you're doing a full-blown HTTP redirect, like if the server tells the browser to go somewhere else, then you do not have scope under 643 and 1161. So if it's an HTTP thing, and you should defer to your web devs or otherwise technical resources if you are not that person yourself, then you don't have to do anything about 643 and 1161. On the other hand, if JavaScript is performing the redirect from within the web page, then yeah, that script is in scope for these things and needs controls. And then while we're here, and I have it on the screen, there's one other thing in here about single page applications, which I want to call out in case you haven't seen it. A single page application is a kind of web page and web app where when you click on a link in a web page, you get a new web page. That's traditionally how web applications have worked for since the 90s. What a single page application is where the web page just updates itself. It doesn't load a new thing. It just changes the contents of the existing web page and then continues from there. So because of that, there really is only one, they call it a single page app. There's really only one page in play. Now, what's interesting about that is if that web application accepts cards, then every web page there is no more than one web page. Every part of the web application is in scope for DSS because every interface, everything that you're seeing when you're navigating can load a payment form. So DSS and this e-commerce guidance document now says if you have that case, then your whole website has scope for 643 and 1161. So something else to consider while I had this document on the screen. But that seems like the questions that we got. So I urge you again, if you're interested, hit up sourcedevents.com/free PCI. If you're one of our current customers who joined today and you're curious about those features we talked about, they're just normal platform enhancements. There's no, I promise there's no upsell going on there. But if you do want to know more about that, feel free to reach out to my team or to support@sourcedevents.com, and we can walk you through that in your particular use case. And we'll leave it there. I want to thank everybody for your time today and for your attention. Again, my name is Matt McGurk. I'm Matthew@sourcedevents.com. So if you have any questions afterwards, please let me know. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.